All right, so now what we're going to look at is I've got a scene open with some ivy, and this is Paint Effects ivy. So, but more specifically, if I just play this QuickTime, just a simple camera move, what is going on in here is we've added a few different things from the previous scenes, where now we have something where there's 4 different leaf textures that are being applied to the leaves of the ivy. And then we have a double-sided shader. And then also I've made a couple changes to the shader from what we've seen before, only in that I've added a bump map, and I've also added a transparency map so that you can kind of see the veins of the leaf when it's backlit. And so if we look at a couple of these leaves inside here, you can kind of start to read that the veins are visible. Clearly the bump is visible. And it's a very important thing just to make your plants look more believable and realistic. And so we're going to be using ivy as the example for this. And again, how do we use a script in order to get the UVs for the leaves to get split into multiple regions, UV regions? And then what do the textures look like that we're using? So it's pretty much the same shader as before, just a bump map and a transparency map added. And so relatively simple scene. So if we look at the scene file itself, we'll see that we have a ground plane and ivy, which has been converted to polys, and it started with a Paint Effects brush. So if I select the leaves and I go to the UV texture editor, and let me break this a little open, or open it up a little bit so we can see more. You can see that the UVs are now in a 2x2 grid, or 2x2 layout. So I can make a file texture that has 1, 2, 3, 4 different leaves in it. And if I go and bring Hypershade in here, you'll be able to see what that file texture looks like. And so if we zoom in a little bit, you can see it's simply 4 different leaves. And so with something like ivy, you'll notice that younger leaves are a yellower green while older leaves are a darker green. So I have 4 different leaves. You'll see that they're not all exactly the same size. And so intuitively you would expect that older leaves would be larger, but that's not necessarily true with ivy. And so I've got some variety there. And then in addition, I've made a bump map for the leaves, as well as a transparency map. And this transparency map is going into the refraction color, as well as being multiplied by the translucency. So we're going to just sort of create this whole setup from scratch. So I can go in and just delete what I don't need. So let's just delete all that stuff. So it's gone. And that's just another piece of geometry sitting in here. And let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to open Visor. And with Visor, we're going to go to Plants Mesh and go to the Ivy preset. And then if I draw, it's going to be a little bit small. So I'm going to open my template brush settings, and let's increase the scale a little bit. And so if I put the scale to 1 and draw, we can see it gets a little bit bigger. So that size is probably fine, maybe a little bit bigger, 1.25. And there we go. So there's also a couple other changes that I want to make with my ivy. And so one is that if we look at this brush as it's been created, and let's get a little bit closer to it, you'll see that the branches or the vines of the ivy are rather large compared, or thick compared to the size of the leaves. And with regular ivy, usually the branches are a lot thinner. So that's a change that I want to go in and make. And so I can go to if I go to the template brush settings, which I have here, and make changes, it's not going to update a stroke I've already made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the stroke, go to the attribute editor, and then the changes that I would want to make would be under the ivy brush settings. If I go inside here to tubes and go to creation, you'll see that you have your tube width. And so I'm going to take the tube width, which is width 1, which is sort of at the base, and width 2, which is at the tip. And I'll take width 1, and let's make it, let's say, 0.04. So you'll see the branches got a lot thinner in there. And then the other change that I want to make has to do with the leaves. And so if we scroll down under growth, you'll see that the ivy only has leaves. It doesn't have branches, twigs, flowers, and so forth. And I'm going to go to the leaves. And in here is a new attribute that was added recently called leaf face sun. And so basically for certain types of plants and certain kinds of trees, the orientation of the leaves is upward facing. And so this is something that is important for certain types of plants. And if you look at ivy, very often you'll notice that all of the leaves of the ivy do tend to be facing the sun or facing the sky. So I can just drag this slider all the way to 1. And it's going to help with the look of your ivy. So those are really the only changes I want to make inside there. And so now that I've adjusted the look of my ivy, if I wanted to paint another stroke, I can go back to the Paint Effects tool. But if I draw, you'll see it's using the settings I had before, not the changes I've made to the current or the previous brush. So what I'm going to do is undo. I'm going to select the stroke that I edited, and under Paint Effects, you can say get settings from selected stroke. And so what that's going to do is going to get the settings and apply it to your template brush. So if I say get settings from selected stroke and then go to the Paint Effects tool and draw, you'll see it's now matching the settings that we saw over here. And so if I go to the attribute editor for that, you'll see inside here, if we scroll around, that first let's go up to the top, you'll see that the tube width 1 is at 0.04. And then if we look at the leaves, we'll see leaf face sun is at 1 on the stroke I made before and on this stroke. So it's definitely handy to know that you can, have a pre-existing stroke and just copy its settings. You can also copy it to other strokes. So if I made a change to this stroke that I wanted to apply to this stroke, you would just select that stroke and say, again, get settings from selected stroke, and then apply settings to selected stroke to make changes. So for example, if I go to this one and I decide that I want the, let's say, leaf face sun to be at 0.5, I can then select that, get settings from selected stroke, go to stroke 2, apply settings to selected stroke, and you'll see all those leaves changed. And then let's put it back to 1, get settings from selected stroke, and apply settings to selected stroke. So next thing we're going to do is just draw some ivy inside here. So I'll go and, let's say we'll get rid of that one. Let's move back a little bit. And I'm just moving back so that basically, my camera view is filled with this ground plane. I have construction history off, like we've talked about. That's not something that I need unless I'm going to be wanting some wind inside here, which I don't really need for this example that we're making. And so to draw some more ivy in here, I'll select this. Again, get settings from selected stroke. And then let's go to our Paint Effects tool. Also, I could make the ground plane in here paintable, but by default we paint on the grid and the ground is on the grid. We'll go to another scene later where we're going to be painting on the surface. But for now, I'm just going to go in and let's just draw, a bunch of ivy inside here. And so with ivy, if you draw your main branches, you could draw another one stemming off of that one. So we can see that we have some ivy. Obviously, for some of the later branches that are stemming off other ones, you could reduce the number of steps so that maybe they're not as dense or don't have as many leaves. But for now, we're just putting a bunch of ivy in our scene, which is fine. So let's say we have this. Okay. So we've created a bunch of different strokes inside here. So what do I want to do? Well, the first thing, as we know, is we need to convert these to polys. And so I'm going to go to my stroke, and if I go to the attribute editor, and go to mesh output, I want these to be quads. And so I could go and use the attribute spreadsheet to do this, but for now I'm just going to do it like so because there's not that many strokes in here. So they're all going to output quads. And then with all of these strokes that I have, I want to convert them to poly. So modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. Quad output is checked. Poly limit is pretty high. I have it at 1,000,000. So if I hit convert or apply and close, we'll see we now got 114,000 polygons, and I can go and delete all of these strokes. Now it might be a good idea to maybe leave one of them in here, just so that later on if I want to, again, create some more ivy, I have this sitting around in here so that I can always get settings from it. So it's, even though it's hidden right now, its visibility has been turned off, it's useful to keep it in the scene. So the next step is, how do we go and get the UVs to be different? And so if I grab the leaves right now, again as we've seen, and I go to the UV texture editor, right now it's all in 0 to 1 for each leaf. So to do this, the first step is you need to take your leaves and separate them and then recombine them. It's a very quick thing, meaning just go to Polys, Mesh, Separate, and then once they're separated, they'll still be selected, so you can go to Mesh, Combine. And so I'm going to do this for all of my leaf groups. And so let's go and separate and combine. I could choose to take the leaves for all of these ivy groups and combine them into a single mesh. That would be fine. And the reason we need to do this is because when you separate and combine, it changes the order that the leaves are in, which is important for a script I'm going to be showing you. So separate, combine, separate, combine, separate, combine, separate, combine, and then the last one, separate, combine. All right, so now I could take these poly objects that have been put outside of their individual hierarchies and put them back in if I wanted to. So meaning that this one would go into this group and so forth, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Let me just close these up so that we have a little more room in the outliner. Okay, so now we have these, and we're ready to apply this script. So I have this script sitting on a shelf right here, but I want to show you where to get it. And so it's popping up so you can see the text, but that's not so useful. Basically where it comes from is there's a really wonderful thread at ch08, which is called, if you do a Google search for mental ray forests, you're going to find it. And so if I go and launch Google and bring that in here, and type mental ray forests, and go to this thread at ch08, and then we'll view it in here, and then go to page 15. And on page 15 inside here is where the script is. Okay, so this guy Tostao Wayne has some, of all the people that are in this thread, he's the one that really has some excellent examples as well as information. But what we're looking at is this script right here. And so you can literally just go and copy all of the text that's inside here. Let's not go that high. Like so. So I have it all selected. And just hit Control-C. And so that's the script that we want. And so if we now go into Maya and I go into the script editor and I paste that in here, you could then go and select all of this and middle mouse button drag it to your shelf just to make a button. So that's exactly what this button right here is. That's just, I called it leaves. We're just not seeing the S. So what does it do? Basically, the way that you need to use it is, again, first separate and combine your leaves. And then I'm just going to make a new camera. Hit F. And let's grab one of our leaf objects. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And you want to select a single leaf. And so I'm going to go in here. I'm going to grab a leaf. So I can just select it and then hit Shift, the angled brackets. so that I have a single leaf selected with all of its polys. The script needs to know this because it needs to know how many polygons each leaf has before it executes. And then just click on your button on the shelf. You'll get a simple little pop-up. And you can choose whether you want 2 by 2 or 3 by 3. So this means you would have 4 different leaves or 9 different leaves. So the more the better is the reality. And so we're going to use 2 by 2 just as it's a little less time consuming to make the texture for that. So with 2 by 2 you'd end up wanting to scan 4 leaves. 3 by 3 you'd have to scan 9. So, but in the long run you'll find that making your own textures for your leaves by scanning leaves is going to really be the most effective way to approach things, really, because you need to scan the front and the back of your leaves. And a lot of libraries out there that have leaves in them tend to only have one side. So let's go and hit process. The script is executing, and so it chooses to color code. So you can now see that these leaves, each leaf has a different color of 4 different colors. And if I now select the leaves, select one, and go to the UV texture editor, there you go. So that's it. It's really simple, and it is awesome. It really, really, really is a critical script for doing plants, trees, anything that needs leaves. So we're going to now repeat the same thing. And so I'm going to go inside here, grab a leaf, so you might want to try and find one that's easy to select, and then shift angle brackets, make sure I got all of them selected, then zoom out, hit the button, process. So clearly if you had something that had 100,000 leaves on it, it would take a little while to calculate, but you can see that for what we have in our scene, it's really calculating rather quickly. So I'm just going to go, and for any ones that I have not done, repeat the same process. So shift angle brackets, make sure you've got all of them. So I'm missing one, there we go, got it. And button, process. And wait. So you could see why it might be a benefit to take all of the leaves for all the different ivy strokes that I created and combine them all into a single object, so you don't have to do this multiple times. But in the end, it's up to you. So let's grab this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Hit shaded mode just so I can see the progress. And let that run. And then got one over here. So that one I can just easily select by marquee dragging. And don't forget the separating the leaves and then recombining them. If you don't do that, the script's going to not give you what you want. So 1, 2, shift and shaded mode and process. Okay, 3 to go. So this is probably getting a little boring to watch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Process. And the last 2. So just looking for a leaf, easy to select, shift angle brackets, shaded mode, leaves, process. And the last one. And so the way that they're getting different colors is that the script is actually generating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 4 shaders in Hypershade that we'll see that are assigned to the 4 different UV regions. And so that it basically is really just for the purpose of giving you visual feedback. And so at this point, let's save our scene. And so let's just call this Ivy tutorial 01. And now let's take a look at Hypershade. So in Hypershade, these are all the shaders that we got from PaintFX, which we don't need. And in here specifically, we can see the 4 different shaders that the script made. So you're going to end up dumping them. You don't need them. But it's just useful because it gives you some visual feedback. So the next step now is to make our shader. And so now we're going to go and create a double-sided shader for the ivy, where we have 4 different leaf textures and a bump map and a transparency map. And so let's move on to that next. So again, hit save, and let's move on. So step 1 really before we go in and create the shader for this is going to be to have some leaves to texture this with. So if I go to Photoshop, what I did is I went in and just went outside and grabbed 4 ivy leaves and scanned the front and the back of each one. And so if I go in here and grab ivy A, back and front, and hit open, I have 2 scans. We'll see that the scans are a decent resolution. They don't have to be too big depending on how close you're going to get to your leaf, but clearly I'm not going to really be getting any closer than that. And then it's the process that we've seen before of just going and taking one, copying it, putting it here, pasting it, flipping it horizontally, and then don't need that one anymore. And then I can go in and make that a layer as opposed to the background, delete that. And then for each of these I can just go and delete out what I don't need. As opposed to erasing, it's easier to just marquee drag. And then once I've just, quickly deleted some junk inside here, then for the back here, lower the opacity and get these to be aligned. So Control T, and then it's not something that takes very long to do. Might want to zoom in. And so I'm less concerned about the stem, more about the leaf itself. Use the arrow keys to get them to be lined up. And I can see inside here that it's kind of close enough. So don't really need to be too anal about it because you're going to end up erasing out the profile of it. And so once I have that, then it's just a matter for the leaf A and leaf B to erase out the white, which you could try and do with the magic wand tool just to make it a little bit quicker. But you're still going to end up needing to do a little bit of manual erasing. And so if I go to the magic wand tool and I click on the white, clearly it's a start point. So I can go and hit delete and then do the same thing on layer 2. Delete that out. And then to make it easier to see what I'm doing, I'm going to put black behind everything. But we can see the edge that we get from the magic wand tool is kind of ugly. And so you're going to end up needing to go in and erase stuff out anyway. But if I just do it one leaf at a time, so I grab this leaf, go to the erase tool, and then using a tablet inside here, I would start erasing. And I would use a hard edge on that brush. And so then go in and just start erasing out. And obviously you can use whatever technique you want, but you're going to get a nicer edge doing it yourself than with the magic wand tool. And it doesn't matter if you go in, like you're not trying to be too anal, you're just trying to make sure you get rid of all of the white that's inside there. And so going in on this side and bring it down. So I'm not going to show you this process for all the leaves because that would get really boring to watch. But basically doing that for one leaf and then selecting the pixels from it after you've done it, and then using this mask to go to the other leaf and erase out the corresponding pixels. So if I hide the mask, Control H, and then invert the selection, and then Control H, and then hit delete, if we look in this region, it's taken the mask from the other leaf because you want the masks to align perfectly. And then in the end, they each have their own, layer transparency, but that's something that we'll end up converting to an alpha channel later. So that's the process you would end up going through. So in here, I did it for 4 leaves. You can see A, B, C, and D. So the reality is you're going to, the more the better. But for that, you then need to take these and merge these together so that you can create your different textures, as we see here. So here's my PSD for the 4 leaves. Let me open it. And so I made my, if we go to image size, 1600 by 1600, just because based on the scans and the resolution of the scans, that's the size that worked out for me. Obviously, I don't need something that's so high res for leaves. I could resize this later to a 1K map, or even 512 by 512 if the leaves are going to be smaller or farther away from camera. But with this, once I had something that was easy to divide by 2, I could then just go and turn my rulers on, Control R, so I could go and make some guidelines inside here. And the ones I made obviously were just to split this into 4 quadrants. Then what's useful is to get your UV snapshot inside here, which is what we're looking at. So I'm going to hide the guides. And so that's, as you should know, just in Maya, grabbing one of the leaf groups and going to the UV texture editor for one of these leaves, which right now is not wanting to show my UVs because Maya is being annoying. UV texture editor. Okay, so let's go inside here and let's take a look at what's going on with our leaves here. Okay, what happened is, which is the case sometimes with scripts, they do things that are funny. And so sometimes the script chooses to split the UVs into the 4 groups that you asked for, but occasionally it offsets them from 0 to 1. And so I just took a look in there and found that that's what happened, and that's why we weren't seeing the UVs for some of these. So if I go to the UV texture editor again, this is, of course, what we want it to look like. And so occasionally with the script, you'll see that it'll split it into 4 groups, but they will be offset a little bit. And so in this case, when this happens, it's rather simple to just go in and manually just move them into 0 to 1. So it's something that is a little annoying that that happens, but it's just the nature of the script. So there may be other scripts out there that do the same thing that don't have this issue, but for now I've found that most of the time it doesn't do this. So this time it did, but not a big deal. And so I'm just going and getting the UVs to be where we want them to be. And so now we can see inside here we have our UVs into 4 different quadrants, all in 0 to 1. And so even though there's a slight offset between these two, for example, because I manually moved 4 of them, it doesn't really matter because it'll still work for the texture that we're going to create. And so, like I was saying, you want to take the UVs that you have for the leaf groups and then do a UV snapshot. And so that's just going to save out an image of the UV snapshot. And then if we go back to Photoshop, that's what I'm looking at here. And so basically we can see that if I go and zoom in a little bit, we can see that our leaf is inside each individual quadrant. We can see the UVs are scaled so that they don't go all the way to the edge. That's just basically the way the script works. And so I just have to make sure that my leaves are not going to get cut off. And so we can see that they are all correctly bound. And then for leaves that are smaller, you can see I'm aligning them towards the bottom edge of the UV. And so for something like paint effects, basically the bottom of a leaf is the part that's touching the stem or the branch. And so that's why if you are going to have smaller leaves, don't put them in the center, put them all the way at the bottom. So the way this Photoshop file was created, like I was talking about, is if we look in here, we'll see that we have a few different layers. And so the first step after I combined the front and the back so that they were aligned with each other was to go in and obviously have the front and the back inside this file, like so, perfectly aligned. I could then, since the front or the back both have the exact same transparency, I can then select those pixels and go to select Save Selection. And what this does is gives me an alpha channel that you can see I have in this file, which is for my cutout opacity. So back out here, some of the other layers that we have is for, let's say, the back inside here. So let me turn everything off. So I like to have a background color, so if I turn it off, we're just going to end up with nothing. So by having something inside there, and let's turn off our UVs, I'm just picking a color that roughly matches the color of the leaf. So it's not completely necessary, but if for some reason you had done something funky when you painted the mask and you were off a little bit, at least you get a background color that's similar. But obviously you want to make sure that your mask is correctly created. So with something like this, with the back color, leaf A back is the name of the layer, but it's really leaves A, B, C, and D. With its background color, I can then save this out as my color map, which needs to have the alpha channel embedded, so it's RGBA. And so that's just a matter of going to File, Save As, and I would choose As a Copy, so it flattens the image without layers. So As a Copy with alpha channels. It'll flatten my image as I have it in Photoshop, so only the layers that are visible will be merged, and then it'll include the alpha channel that I have for cutout. And then I would choose a file format, let's say like TIFF or Targa, and save it out, and this would become my, since we're dealing with the back layer, this would become the back color. And then you would do the exact same thing for the front. So the other textures that I created in here are the bump map and the transparency map. So for leaf A back bump, we go inside here and look at that, then this is simply a grayscale version of the back where I adjusted levels a little bit. So, and then the background color, it's actually a good idea to adjust the background color. And let me just go and adjust levels, just so that it's roughly the same value. You can squint your eyes and get it kind of close to the value of the leaves. Otherwise, when you use this as a bump map, you're going to end up with it's kind of something that looks like it's sort of bumping in or bumping out along the edge of the leaf, which you might not want. Another good thing to do to avoid that is just to blur the edge of your bump map to avoid that. So that's basically the bump. And so this is the bump for the back and the bump for the front. And so again, the background color we would want in here would be actually something that's much closer to the values that are in the bump to reduce that edge that you might get. And so now granted, if you really take the time to look at a leaf, you'll see that the grayscale version or the luminance of the color doesn't really create something that is in nature what the bump truly looks like for the leaf. If you really wanted that, you'd have to go in and hand paint your bump because it's something that is going to be a little off. You could use something, let's say there's things like XNormal and other tools out there that allow you to create normal maps from shaded photos, and that's obviously another way to go and create something so that you get a more accurate bump. And so for our leaves right now, a grayscale version is going to work fine just to create breakup. It's really an issue of how close your camera is going to get to the leaves. So if these are mid-background objects, doing it the quick way with a grayscale image is going to be okay. So this image then gets saved out as your bump, and so the bump map doesn't need an alpha channel. So when I save this out, I would just say as a copy, no alpha, no layer, it's just going to be flattened. And this in the end is my front bump, so that would go there. So, and then finally, there's your transparency. And so let me just turn off a couple of these layers. And for the transparency we have, it looks like this. And so you're really just trying to highlight the veins in the leaf. And you'll find that you may intuitively think that you could just go and take your color map, make it grayscale, and adjust levels to highlight the leaf, but that's not going to work very well unless you have a leaf where in the scan of the leaf, let's look at the color, there is a very clear distinction in value, not just color, between the veins and the rest of the leaf. So in some of these leaves you can see the distinction is not very clear. And so when you make, let's go and do this manually. If I duplicate this layer, and then for this layer, let's say we go to hue saturation and get rid of color, and then Control L for the levels tool. If I go in here and really boost the levels, you can see that, trying to really get the veins to be separated isn't really going to work out that well. And so that's why in the end what I did here, if we look, let me delete that now, at the transparency that I have, this is something that's just made by just making it grayscale and then just erasing out manually what I don't need. Or you could just go in on top of your leaf and hand paint where the veins are. That's going to give you something that's going to work the best in the end. So a little time consuming, but necessary. And so the purpose of the transparency map, again, is so that when you see your leaf backlit and you're looking at the translucency, that the veins are usually a little bit thicker on a leaf than the rest of the leaf. And so they're going to feel a little bit more opaque. And so this helps to accentuate the veins within your leaves. And so a simple map to create. And so in the end, if we take a look inside here, we have our color for the back and our color for the front with 4 leaves, our bump map for the back and the front, and then this transparency map to accentuate the veins. And I can use this for both the back and the front because in the end it's the same leaf, and so the vein pattern is going to be the same on both sides of the leaf. And so this ends up going into, obviously, your diffuse color. This can also go into your translucency color. So you might end up making a couple changes to the translucency color, but you can make those if you want using color gain and color offset in Maya. The bumps, and then the translucency is going to, or the transparency goes into refraction color and also gets multiplied by the color map for the translucency, which you can do in your shading network in Maya. So with all of that said, let's go back to Maya and build our shading network. So what we want the shading network to look like is something that I already have in here. So first, obviously, you need a texture for all of the branches that we have. And so for that, if we look at what's currently mapped to it, and let me just grab one of them. This is the shader that was made by Maya, which really doesn't make any sense, for the branches that has this leaf inside here. And so what I'm actually using is, let's see, which one is it? I think I need to name this. No, not that one. Just this simple one. So this is just another sort of preset Paint Effects one. You could go and make your own, but we're not going to be seeing these up close. It's just a repeating texture that has a little bit of color multiplied into it with a ramp. It's gamma corrected because we're using physical sun and sky. And then we have this shader. And so I'm going to double click on it and give it a name. So we'll call this Ivy Branches. So I want that assigned to the branches inside here. So I can select all of those so we can see what's selected and assign it. And then for the actual ivy, for all of the leaves, the shader that I have inside here is this one. And so, as we saw earlier, we have a 2-sided shader. So we have, if we look at the name, Ivy Leaf Front MIA, it's an MIA material, as well as Ivy Leaf Back MIA. And then the result of the front is going into an MIB 2-sided node, which again is created under Mental Ray. And then in Mental Ray you can go to Sample Compositing, and we'll see MIB 2-sided. So when you create that node, again, the front of the leaf, the result goes into the front of the 2-sided material or utility. Back goes into back, so the result goes into back. And then again, we cannot assign this directly to our leaves. We have to output it and pump it through a surface shader. So the out value of the MIB 2-sided goes into the color of a surface shader. And as we saw earlier, Maya or Hypershade doesn't know exactly how to interpret that, so you get some kind of corrupted, funky looking colors in your shader ball, like so, but that doesn't matter. It works in your render. So as far as the front and the back go, it's exactly what we created earlier in our 2-sided shading network. And specifically what we created for an individual leaf texture. So if we look at an individual one, we can see that it's an MIA material. So let's double click on it. And for it, you can see that I have my glossiness at 0.3. So the front of the leaves are, a little bit shiny. They're going to have a specular highlight on it that's kind of noticeable. While if I go to the back of the leaf, select the back, you'll see the glossiness is 0.2. So the back of the leaf is a little bit less glossy than the front of the leaf. So also inside here, if I go to the BRDF, the reflection curve, we can see on the back of the leaf I have it set to 0.2 and 0.7. The front of the leaf, 0.2 and 1. So the front or the top of the leaf is a little bit more reflective at glancing angles. For both the front and the back, we'll see that under reflection, I have skip reflection on inside turned off. Remember, it's on by default. And so this is just going to make sure that both the top and the back of your leaves are going to be reflective. And then for refraction, remember that these are thin-walled because there's no thickness to the geometry for your leaves. And so I have thin-walled turned on for both the front and the back. And then for the translucency, I have the value at 0.25 for transparency for both the front and the back inside here. And then if we go down to the translucency folder, use translucency as on, of course, with a weight value of 1, so that we're fully translucent and opaque. We're not actually seeing transparency or seeing through the leaf. So what's different in here from before what we saw? It's the inclusion of the bump map as well as inside here a transparency map. Bump map is very simple. So on the MIB or MIA nodes, we can see, close everything up, I have standard bump mapped with a regular bump 2D node. On my bump map, if I go to effects, I have the filter lowered down a little bit just because, as I've mentioned, Maya blurs your textures by default quite a bit. And so I've just lowered the blur on my bump. And then on the bump 2D node, it's just a regular bump. I have my bump depth set to 0.5. That's something that's easily adjusted as you do render tests to see how deep you want your bump to be. So basic bump map. So then as far as the transparency map, where is that going? The transparency map, if we go to our MIA material and go to refraction, is mapped to the refraction color. With the shader for leaves that we created earlier, the color was just white, a solid white. And so by mapping a texture for your veins like so, it's still pretty much solid white everywhere. It's just where the veins are is a darker value. And so you're going to see less refraction and more specifically less translucency in those areas. They'll feel a little bit more opaque. But you'll also want to take that and multiply it into your map that you're using for translucency. So looking at our, let's just graph this one. Looking at our MIA material, this color map that was created in Photoshop is mapped to the diffuse color going, as we can see, through a gamma correct node. Obviously, the out transparency is being reversed and pumped into a luminance node to go into cutout opacity. But then down here, I have the color map again being gamma corrected, multiplied by 4 because my well, let's go on outside here. My transparency is set to 0.25. 0.25 times 4 equals 1, and that's how we decide the value that goes on the multiply node. And then my transparency map is also going into this color map as color gain. So we're multiplying this map by this map for translucency. So this, in the end, is what the shader looks like. So it's everything we did before. We've just introduced 4 different leaves instead of 1, a bump map, and a transparency map. So let's take this shader, specifically the surface shader for the two-sided, grab all of our leaves, so they're all selected, and I will assign that surface shader to it. And so, and just, if we wanted to go and take a look and see, what things looked like without the bump and without the transparency, let's actually go and do that first. So let's say we go in, just so we have some comparisons, select all the leaves, and let's assign just the front to them. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect the bump, and I'm also going to disconnect this transparency map. So I'm just going to grab its connections. And then on the front, I'll just make sure the color is white for refraction, which is the default color. So this is basically a shading network like we created before. No bump, no transparency. And this is assigned to all the leaves. So they're all only going to get the front texture. They're not going to be double-sided. And then we'll sort of reconnect these things and see how it improves. So now before I do a render, or before we get it to double-sided rendering, one thing to point out is when you use Paint Effects, let's go to another camera, to create your ivy, and you use the leaf face sun slider so that our leaves are, as we can see, angled a little bit more towards the sky. This is kind of an important point, is that the normals of your leaves are something that you want to check out. And so specifically the front on a two-sided material with that two-sided utility node that we used is considered to be the side where the normals are pointing out. And if I go to display polygons and turn on face normals and make them a little bit smaller, you'll see that the normals are pointing down. So this is considered to be the back that's facing up, which is not what I want. So what you want to do is select all of the leaves in your scene, if you're using ivy with leaf face sun, and go to normals reverse. So that now if I select this ivy and display the face normals, make them a little smaller, and zoom in, you'll see that the normals are pointing up towards the sky, so that the front is going to get the correct texture when you use the two-sided node and map your front shader to the front slot. So that was just an important thing to point out. All right, so now let's go in and do a render test. So I'm going to go to the render view and launch a render real quick. Okay, so that finished. Save the image. And we can see inside here that we're getting, first of all, 4 different leaf textures. If you look around, you'll see that leaf is smaller than the leaf next to it. So we do get some variety and breakup of leaves. We'll see we have some darker green and some lighter green leaves, so that's good. So our 4 different textures or leaf scans are being applied around on our leaves. So, but without the bump or the translucency or the transparency map, you can see that the specular highlights on these leaves are very, very clean, and it makes them look a little bit artificial. And so let's now go in and connect the bump map as well as the transparency map and compare the results. So if I go to Hypershade, so let's go back to the shading network, and then inside here, for the front texture, we want to get the bump map connected, and then we're also going to assign the two-sided node so that we have different textures on the front and the back. So we can start by doing that. So let's go and grab all of our leaves and let's assign the surface shader to it. And then let's go and get that bump map in here. And so that's going to be sitting inside here. So let's go and find that. And so this is the front of the leaf. So I want to find the texture that corresponds to the front. So this is the back. So that's what I want right there, is that node. And this already has a bump 2D node connected to it. So if I just go and do input output, I can see there's my bump 2D node that we had from before. Let me go to the MIA material and scroll down to bump, and then drag that bump 2D node into standard bump. So I've reconnected the bump map. Then, as far as the transparency map goes, on my MIA material, I want to go to the refraction color and drag that in there. And then for the texture that I'm using for my translucency, so again the texture that's mapped to the translucency color, which is this one, I want to go to its color gain, and I want to map the transparency map to color gain, because that is a multiplier. So if we compare, we can see the map that's being used for color, the veins are not accentuated, while the map that's being used for translucency, we can see that the veins are accentuated. So it's a little bit of a small swatch, but you can see without the multiplied map and with the multiplied map. So bump is reconnected, transparency map is reconnected. All of the leaves inside here have been assigned the surface shader. And so now we're going to go back to the render view window and launch one more render so we can compare. Alright, so that finished. And now if we take a look, we're going to see that there's a lot more diversity of color inside here as far as the greens go, because we have the two-sided material. But we'll also notice that we can see breakup in the spec, and so due to the bump map. And so if we look in different areas inside each leaf, we can see the specular highlights are now receiving the bump, which makes them look a lot better. As far as the transparency map, we're kind of far away from the leaves right now, so it's not very clear. So what I'll do is another render where we're a little bit closer so that we can evaluate that. But basically we're now, due to the double-sided shader, transparency map, and bump, getting something that's starting to look a lot more realistic. And so let's just do another more close-up render for that. Also, one thing to point out that I noticed when I was looking at the last render that we did is something seemed off, and it's the shadows on the ground. This is something that's important to point out. So with the last render we did, using the double-sided shader, you'll notice that while the ivy looks better and more natural with more variety, the shadows compared to our previous render look different. So this is the render where we're just using the front shader on all of the leaves. And so if we compare the two renders, you'll see that what's happening is that here the shadow is correctly being calculated based on the cutout opacity. So with the double-sided shader that's going through a surface shader, the surface shader is not seeing the cutout opacity, and therefore the shadow that's being cast by each of these leaves is the original sort of square poly. And so what you need to do to get that to work correctly is if we go to Hypershade, let me just get that open, and over here, basically we need to tell the surface shader how to calculate its shadows. And so here's our double-sided shader, and on the surface shader what you'll need to do is graph the input-output just so you can see its shading group. And on the shading group, what you're going to need to do is make a connection. And specifically, you're going to want to go to the shading group node, go to the mental ray folder, and then inside here under custom shaders, you want to provide a shadow shader. And so what I did is I just middle mouse button dragged the front MIA material and dragged it directly to shadow shader. So you can see it's Ivy Leaf front MIA. And so that'll tell the shading group how to calculate the shadows for these objects. And so alternately, you can try and take the out transparency of your file texture and plug it into the out transparency of the surface shader, but it doesn't work as well. And so if you try that, you'll find that it'll take a little longer to render. So simply just go to the shading group and provide a shadow shader. So this is anytime you're doing a double-sided shader. So there you go. So if I look at the render that I did with that connected, you'll see that we're now getting correct shadows. So if we now go in here and let's say we delete that render, we can now compare these two, and we're going with no bump and no translucency map or rather transparency map, to having the double-sided shader. So now we're starting to see the lighter color on the back side of the leaves, as well as the bump map. If you just sort of grab a specific leaf and look at it as I go between the two, you can see the bump coming in. And then let's do a closer up render so it's easier to evaluate the transparency map. So let's do that next. So I'm just going to go in here and let's just move the camera a little closer to our ivy. And let me just get the camera to be a little bit more responsive. And then since now we have some that are close up and some that are farther, if we're going to use this camera view, I'm going to grab the ground plane and just move it so it fills our whole area in the camera. So maybe I need to scale it up a little bit just so that we're seeing ground everywhere. And I've got my directional light right there for the sun, so maybe we'll try doing a little bit more backlighting on it. And let's go in and do a render with that camera view. All right. So now that we're a little closer, it's a lot easier to check out the result of the changes we've made, specifically the bump. So if we look around, we can definitely evaluate that it makes a very big difference. And so clearly the breakup that you see in the speck on the leaves coming from the bump is a critical part of making the leaves look believable, especially if they're going to be mid-ground or objects that are as close as this. I did another render or even closer, and this makes it a little easier to see the veins in the backlighting on some of these leaves, as well as the fact that, you know, based on the glancing angle of the sun coming in, it just really makes the leaves look a lot better. So the bump map that I have, being a grayscale version of the color map, isn't completely true to what Ivy is like, but it works. And so it's just a matter of, you know, how much time you need to work on this asset. So if you're doing something that's a mid-ground asset, it's not hero, it's really not a big deal just to do it the way I showed you. So if it's a hero object, then clearly you would take a little more time. You know, it might not take that long to hand paint the bump for these, but it's important to point out. So anyway, that's pretty much how to break your UV groups into 4 different regions using this script that I have up on my shelf that I pointed out. You could grab it on page 15 of the Forest thread at CG Talk. And then how to make the double-sided shader with correct shadows by taking one of the MIA materials for the front or the back and plugging it into the shadow slot on the shading group for the surface shader, and all the other stuff we did. So now that we're on the topic of Ivy, let's take a look at one more thing that's useful, a tool called the Ivy generator. We'll talk about that briefly, and then we'll return to our library and sort of evaluate the plants we made and maybe import them into another scene, just so you can see the workflow for using your library as a start point for your shaders, importing them into another scene, painting paint effect stroke on a surface that's paintable, and populating a scene with some plants. And so let's move on to that.